Okay, AP US History students, this is your final review before the AP US History exam. We're going to pick up in the second half of period 7, go all the way up to period 9. For me, this is a Saturday morning, so I've just woken up and I am excited and ready to go in order to finish this up for you guys. Hopefully this is going to help you out to get ready for that big AP US History exam that is coming very soon. So I want to start off with the major key concepts of these periods. Again, with key concepts, it's not so important that you're knowing the exact language, or you're memorizing this word for word, but that you're getting the overall story of where this is going. So from period 7 to 9, the first key concept is about how the United States becomes a global leader and that has far-reaching effects for both domestic and international policies. The other big thing that happens during this time period are the new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts to promote an expanded role of government. But then there are responses to that. There are responses everywhere from people who are critical of it on the conservative side, people accepting of it on the liberal side, and people who are critical, but critical because they feel like it didn't go far enough. And that tends to be more on the American left. Also, we have the post-war economic and demographic changes, so things like the baby boom, that had huge consequences for American society, politics, and culture. And then last off in the 1980s, a newly ascendant conservative movement that responded to all of this and has had influence on us ever since. So you can kind of think of this time period starting with the Great Depression and the New Deal leading into the Cold War, the civil rights movements, and then the responses to that. That's basically what these key concepts are getting at. So we're actually going to start off with the Roaring Twenties because that sort of sets our contextualization for what happens with the Great Depression and the New Deal. So remember that during the Roaring Twenties, what got the economy going, and usually always happens with business cycles, are major technological changes. In this case, domestic items like the icebox, we might call it the refrigerator, back then it's called the icebox, the radio, movies, and the airplane. This was our first major significant demographic move, not into urbanization, but suburbanization. Now, again, most people are going to be living in the farmlands still. There's a significant number of people in the urban areas, smaller percentage in suburbs, but we're seeing a rise in the rate of people moving into suburbs. That's why it's so important. So why did this take place? Well, Wall Street at the time saw a surge of investment due to buying on the margin, and consumerism increased due to installment payments. In both of those cases, notice what's happening here. People are buying based upon credit. The problem is in the economy after about 1926, we don't really see an increase in real wages. The reason why it's going to be so important is when the stock market crashes, people really have a hard time having enough savings in order to bolster that crash. The major presidents of this time period, including Harding, Hoover, and Coolidge, and their presidencies were marked by laissez-faire economics, so the government kind of stepping back. You'll probably oftentimes hear that that wasn't always the case for certain presidents. For example, Coolidge was very laissez-faire. Hoover did have some governmental interference in the economy, but overall it's a matter of degree. All of these presidents tended to be much more laissez-faire. In 1928, the stock market crashed, and that's going to lead us up to the Great Depression. So what were the causes of the Great Depression? First off, I think what's important, it gets kind of complicated. The Federal Reserve wanted to protect the gold stock that was at the time. Remember, money was backed up by gold at this time period. The problem was that as the economy was growing and inflating, the fear was people would pull the gold out because they would fear that gold had gotten too expensive, so they would buy it back, pull it out, and go invest it somewhere else. And so in order to deal with this, the Federal Reserve raised their interest rates. This caused a loss of faith in the stock market. The stock market tumbled down. Now, typically, that could be solved pretty easily. Stock market goes on these swings. The problem was that there was increased public debt at the time due to buying on the margin and installment payments. Now, the Federal Reserve could have solved this. There was a very simple way for them to do this. Federal Reserve could have just dispersed more gold out to smaller banks in order to bolster those banks and allow people to borrow money. But the fear in the Federal Reserve is that if they did this, it would cause deficits and debts to occur. So they decided not to do this. And so in 1928, we didn't really hit a Great Depression, but because the Federal Reserve did not react quick enough, from 1930 to 1932, the economy collapsed. And as it did so, unemployment rose to over 25%. So what was the response to this? Remember, we talked about how Herbert Hoover did have some governmental interference, and he did. He tried voluntary acts with businesses and banks, and he also tried to set up government loaning agencies in order to try to help out with the economy, but it just wasn't enough. Then on top of all that, he saw that there was a imbalanced budget, and so he had the Congress raise what was called the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised tariffs on agricultural goods. He was hoping that would protect agriculture and raise enough money in order to pay off our imbalance. Instead, it caused a major tariff war with Europe. So in 1932, things were pretty bad, and a new president comes in office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wins that election promising a new deal, a new way of looking at things. And the best examples of that there were two New Deals. The first one, 1932-1936, he tries to provide some reconstruction to the economy with a bank holiday, which for 100 days, banks were closed. Then there was the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was meant to fix the banks by basically putting a wall between investment banks and commercial banks in order to try to give people a sense that if they put their money back into the economy, it would be safe. He also provided federal insurance up to $500 for people who put their money into banks. And then he did public works projects like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, with the hope that by having people do tasks, even if it was raking up leaves, the idea was that they would get money and they would spend it on the economy. Now, this had kind of mixed effects. The GDP grew, but unemployment did not go down by that much. It went from about 25% down to maybe 19%. Then all of a sudden in 1936, we saw a massive recession that took place within the Great Depression. Now, there's a controversy over why that happened. For many, the reason why that happened was because FDR's more conservative advisors said stop spending on the economy. He did, and that caused the economy to go into sort of a spiral downwards. So in the second New Deal, he established a retirement program, Social Security, and he began doing Keynesian deficit spending. Now, FDR was criticized on multiple levels for this. One, he was criticized by conservatives for overstepping his boundaries. A good example of that was the packing of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, on many occasions, had voted down many of FDR's acts as being unconstitutional, especially the agricultural acts. They also voted down a number of other acts as well, like the NRA, the National Recovery Act. So in order to deal with this, FDR said, look, what I'm going to do is for every justice who's above the age of 70, I'm going to put on another justice, which meant he would be packing the Supreme Court on his side. Liberals and conservatives said this is going above bounds because this means the executive would control the judicial branch. Another example where he was criticized was the Agricultural Adjustment Acts. His first Agricultural Adjustment Act called for farmers to basically burn crops and kill livestock. And why do this? Well, to limit the amount of supply. If you limit the amount of supply, demand goes up, and then prices would go up for farmers. Farmers would be able to make more money. This was deemed to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So in the second AAA, FDR said, okay, we're not going to burn crops and kill livestock. We're going to pay farmers not to farm as much. We're going to give them subsidies. Another example is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, in which the federal government went out and established public programs to build dams for water and electricity. The big criticism there was that there was nothing in the Constitution that gave the federal government the right to step into states on the issue of electricity. So the big debate we end off with at the end of the New Deal is the debate between Keynesian economics versus laissez-faire, which will eventually become supply-side economics. So that's how we get into this post-World War II political debate. In 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Vice President Truman then takes over, and Truman called for a fair deal, which was basically an extension of the New Deal. That meant increases of Social Security. He wanted to see universal health care and a funding of public education. But in 1946, the Republicans win the Congress, and the Republicans are able to basically stop Truman from doing a lot of this. They also passed, for example, the Taft-Hartley Act, which overturned the Wagner Act from the New Deal, and that basically stopped unions from gaining a lot of power. The Wagner Act had allowed unions to have what's called a closed shop, meaning if you want to join a business, you have to join the union. The Taft-Hartley Act said you cannot do that. So that's an example of how the Republicans kind of slowed Truman down. In 1952, Eisenhower came into office and initially called for an end to the New Deal, but in reality what he did was to slow it down. So he slowed down the increases to Social Security. He actually spent a ton of money on the National Highways Act, which was a massive public works project, and he allowed for a continuance of the top marginal income tax rates, which were at 90%. So the big part of the debate at this point really is how far should Keynesian economics go? It wasn't really, do we do Keynesian economics or not? It was, what's the degree of Keynesian economics that we should do? So all this leads up to then this incredible economic growth of the 1950s, and it's known as the consensus period because of the general common prosperity that took place. After World War II, there was this massive baby boom that took place as soldiers came home. The government funded the GIs who came home through the GI Bill to go back into college. And they provided loans to buy houses. There was a massive move into the suburbs. And at the time, Levy creates Levittown, which was a creation of mass production of homes. That allowed for people to afford buying into these suburbs. Now, keep in mind that the towns created in Levittown segregated out African Americans. 1950s and 1960s are viewed then as that time period of the golden age of American capitalism, with increased economic growth at huge GDP rates, and what it looked like was prosperity for everybody. However, there were some major critics. There was a man named David Reisman who started criticizing suburbanization, not for the economic side, but what he saw as being material conformity, that everybody was doing the exact same things. Michael Harrington, who was a socialist, pointed out the continued poverty in areas of the United States, especially the Appalachian Mountains. There was C. Wright Mills, who was a sociologist, who said, yeah, we have economic growth, but why? Because we're spending a ton of money in the Cold War on the military-industrial complex, especially NSC 68, which increased government spending by 500% on military items. And then there were the beat poets. The beat poets were young poets who said, you know something, this conformity is too stifling. We need to experiment in life, create our individuality. And they experimented in radical ways, including their lifestyle, with drugs, and with sexual behavior. That leads us into the Cold War because that really sets that large context for this criticism that's taking place. So in 1945, George F. Kennan writes the long telegram in which he calls for containment and an encirclement of the Soviet Union. He claimed, you know, Marxism calls for a takeover of the world. That's not what Russia is after. Russia is really after its own interests, but they are a danger because they are looking to strategic areas of the world to promote their interests. So what Truman does is he establishes a whole bunch of policies based upon containment. The Marshall Plan, giving money to Europe to rebuild its industry to join the capitalist marketplace. The Truman Doctrine, providing aid to anti-communist groups in Turkey and Greece to stop the spread of communism. And as we talked about, NSC 68, upping the amount of military spending, especially on nuclear arms. In 1949, all of this really comes to a head because of a whole bunch of different things that happen that scare Americans. For one, China fell to communism. It was found out there were atomic spies in America, and the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb. So that leads into then a new policy under Eisenhower, or was it? So Eisenhower comes in and says, okay, because of all these mistakes Truman made, we need to have a more aggressive policy, which he calls rollback and brinksmanship. Basically, we're going to test the Soviet Union, see how far we can push them. He also uses the CIA to go into different countries and to overthrow those communist leaders or socialist leaders that he believes are connected to the Soviet Union. But this all comes to a head in the mid-1950s when the Soviet Union went in to crush a rebellion in Hungary. As they drove their tanks in, Hungary called out for Eisenhower to help, and he felt that if he did that, he could risk World War III. By doing that, he reverted back to containment, and that pretty much is where we ended off with at that point. So, of course, in the midst of all these things happening in foreign policy, we have the civil rights movement, and that really starts to question a lot of the things that are going on with that consensus period. So at the end of World War II, there was a questioning of racism due to the fight against Hitler. And in 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, the court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and that principle is separate but equal. The next piece of events that kind of provided the momentum was in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, which led to the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., and his principle of nonviolent strategy. There were three major organizations that picked up on Martin Luther King's beliefs: SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference; CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality; and the NAACP, which had been around for some time, but they continued with Martin Luther King's ideas, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This all led up to the two major acts that changed the way things were being done in the country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which allowed the government now to end segregation in private and public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended the registration tests, poll taxes, and went after the KKK to stop them from stopping black people from voting in the South. But in the 1960s, things turned much more radical. There was a sense that things were not moving quick enough and things were not moving effectively enough. And so we get that model that we talked about in class of integration versus separatism. So Martin Luther King promoted that idea of integration. If we can just get people to work together over time, racism would die off. Malcolm X, though, says this is not possible because of power inequalities. No matter what, white people are not going to give up their power. And so he calls for racial solidarity and black empowerment. A good example of that was the Black Panthers, who had that notion of local black empowerment in areas like Oakland and Los Angeles to deal with problems of poverty, education, and police brutality. The same idea is brought up in other movements, like, for example, the women's movement. Betty Friedan started off in the feminine mystique, calling for women to be seen as needing education and being able to go out into the public sphere. But the radical feminists said, no, this is not enough. The truth is men are never going to give up their power, even within the job market. And so we have to challenge patriarchy itself. Or take, for example, the American Indian movement, which had called for reforms on reservations. There was a new movement called AIM that actually went much further. They actually took over the island of Alcatraz for a weekend and called for the American government to allow American Indians to have their own areas in which they could develop themselves. And then there was the Brown Power and Chicano movement, especially here in the Southwest, people of various different Hispanic backgrounds joining together and trying to promote the interests of different Hispanic communities, especially migrant communities. There was the radical free speech movement on college campuses that called for a much wider expansion of different curriculum people could take, and a criticism especially of what was happening in the Vietnam War. And the anti-Vietnam protest itself led to a more radical notion amongst a broader swath of population against what the American government was doing. So in 1968, then, Nixon wins the election because the Democratic Party was split by 3 nominees. The Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, Robert Kennedy, who would be assassinated very soon before the election, and Eugene Genovese. Nixon is able to win, and his conservatism is rather questionable. On the one hand, he had a long track record of being conservative, and yet at the same time, he did things that were traditionally considered liberal. He wanted to pass, he didn't get it passed, the Family Action Plan, which would have been a basic income for people to get them above poverty to replace welfare. He also established the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a huge government bureaucracy to try and stop pollution in the environment. He also went to China and opened it up to trade, even though he had always spoken out against China because of its communism. So Nixon, in many ways, he was conservative, but for his time period. And what he seemed to be trying to do was to move things further to a slower end than to just keep moving in the direction of Keynesianism. So all this, of course, ends with the Watergate scandal, in which Nixon's advisors, called the Plumbers, broke into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in order to bug it, in order to make sure that Nixon could win in the 1972 election. By the time all this was done, the result, a lot of people thought maybe this would lead into more like a liberal era of government because of this being Nixon conservatism. It didn't. Instead, it led into just a distrust with government itself. And that brings up the problems of the 1970s. The 1970s was this period of incredible tumultuousness that really got Americans to question their own identity. Stagflation was the end of Keynesianism. With stagflation, there was this rise of both inflation and unemployment at the same time, and nobody could figure out why this was happening. There were a variety of different reasons given. One was maybe we're spending too much on the Vietnam War and public programs, and that's rising inflation. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had shrunk the supply of oil, and that raised prices on energy. Also, there's the raised expectations of workers and businesses. This tended to be the conservative idea of Milton Friedman, who said, because people are demanding things on both sides, businesses and workers, that's what's raising both of these problems. Then at the end of the 1970s, there were major foreign problems as well. The Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, threatening the oil market in the Middle East. And the Iranians had a major revolution in which radical Islamic Shiites took over and then took American hostages for an entire year. So this leads into then that last major key concept, in which we now move to a more conservative way of doing things, ending the FDR era, and that is the Reagan Revolution. Reaganomics lowered taxes and regulations in order to stimulate not the demand side, that's FDR's idea, that's Keynesianism, but to stimulate the supply side. How did this work out? Well, there were, from 1983 to 1987, there was massive economic productivity. GDP rose by tremendous amounts. So, and unemployment also fell. So there were some major positives to the Reaganomics era. However, in 1987, the stock market crashed. Throughout this period, there was an increase in economic inequality, and federal debt went up from $800 billion to $3 trillion. So that raises then who comes after Reagan, and that's Bill Clinton. A lot of people think of Bill Clinton as sort of like this resurrection of liberalism. Actually, in many ways, Clinton adopted Reagan's philosophy, but tried to moderate it towards a more liberal viewpoint. So, for example, he raised taxes, goes against Reagan's philosophy. Why did he do this? Not to help out like poor programs for the poor, but to pay down debt to stabilize the market. He also called for free trade for global economics, like, for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, lowering tariffs in order to create more free trade. That then led to the Bush doctrines. And so when Clinton was done, the big question, of course, with the Clinton era was the issue of the integrity of the office, because he left under the veil of an impeachment. He wasn't removed from office, dealing with some of his behavior in the White House. So President Bush came in, and George Bush took up again Reagan's supply-side economics. He had 2 major tax cuts. He also wanted to transition the government out of the private sphere. For example, he passed something called Medicare B, which was meant to contract health insurance, private health insurance companies. He also passed No Child Left Behind, which was an attempt to increase educational vouchers. This would allow parents to get tax cuts if they wanted to move their kids into a private school. Then, in the case of foreign policy, we had the 9/11 attacks by Al-Qaeda, and Bush passed the doctrine which allowed him to preempt any possibilities of countries using terrorists to go after us. And that, of course, led into the Iraq War. However, 2 major problems with the Bush administration that give rise to President Obama was, first of all, the civil war in Iraq and the collapse of the global economy in 2007 and 2008. So Obama, when he came into office, seemed to call for a resurrection of Keynesian economics. And the best example of that is his call for a universal healthcare plan. On foreign policy, he wanted to get us out of the Middle East and shift more to Asian trade. So what kind of takeaways then can we take? Because there's a ton of stuff going on during this period, right? First off, American leadership really develops after World War II due to this desire to create an international economic system. So the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, that desire to create that during the Cold War. Second thing, the civil rights movement and its questioning really led to a major questioning in the 1960s of that consensus period. And then third off, the Vietnam War and the Nixon scandals led to a questioning of American government as a whole. And we're still under the shadow of that as we are dealing with new ways of looking at how we can run our economy and our government. So, a lot of information here. I hope this was helpful to you. As we're getting ready for the AP US History exam, we'll try and break down a lot of this inside of class and make it more understandable so you're ready for the test. Okay? Talk to you later. Bye.